Douglas was a street vendor who, despite working hard, often went the entire day without selling much. He carried his young daughter, Raquel, in his arms, feeling guilty for putting her in such a situation. But unfortunately, he had no other choice. One day, after a long and difficult day of work, something unexpected happened. From a distance, Douglas saw an elderly woman being mistreated and kicked out of a restaurant. The manager was yelling at her, and without thinking much, Douglas decided he couldn't let that happen. He chose to act and defend the woman, unaware that this would change his life forever. That morning, as usual, Douglas woke up very early, even before the sun had risen. The streets were still quiet, with only a few people walking hurriedly. He was already preparing his things: jewelry, phone chargers, and some snacks, anything he could sell to make some money. Since becoming a single father, this was his routine, walking around downtown with his daughter Raquel, who was just 5 years old. Raquel, still a little sleepy, rubbed her eyes as she watched her father get everything ready. "Are we going to sell everything today, Daddy?" she asked hopefully. Douglas smiled, ran his hand through her hair, and said, "We'll try, my dear. Every day is a new chance." Life was tough, but he did everything he could to make sure his daughter had what she needed. Raquel's mother had passed away when she was still a baby, and since then, Douglas had played the role of both father and mother. Despite the financial struggles, the love he had for Raquel kept him strong. They were an inseparable duo, always facing difficulties with courage. Douglas and Raquel's days were always busy. They walked through the bustling streets of the city, offering their products with a smile. Many times, people bought more because of Raquel's charm than out of interest in the products. Douglas knew this and was very grateful for the warmth his daughter inspired. But not every day was easy. Sometimes, sales were so slow that they couldn't even cover basic needs. In those moments, Douglas had to swallow his pride and beg for money. It was a humiliating situation for him. But survival came first, and Raquel, even at such a young age, understood her father's efforts. On one of those difficult days, the sun was already setting, and Douglas was starting to lose hope of making enough money. He and Raquel stopped in front of an upscale restaurant, where people were generally more generous. Raquel held her father's hand, hoping that this would be the moment their luck would change. Douglas was sitting next to his daughter Raquel, watching people walk by on the street. He held a small cardboard sign that read, "Please help us, we need to buy food. Thank you." While scanning the area, hoping for a sign of generosity, he saw something that tugged at his heart. An elderly woman, visibly upset, was being thrown out of a restaurant. The manager, clearly annoyed, shouted, "I already told you, we don't serve customers who can't pay. Get out!" He was pushing the woman out of the restaurant, and Douglas felt a lump in his throat. He knew all too well what it was like to be treated poorly for not having money. He looked at Raquel, who was watching the scene with wide eyes, and made a decision. "Wait here, sweetheart," he told her as he stood up. Raquel nodded, trusting her father. Douglas walked over to the woman, who was now sitting on the sidewalk, quietly crying. "Excuse me, ma'am," he said gently. "Can I help you?" The woman looked up, surprised and grateful. "I don't have enough money to pay for the meal," she said. "I was so hungry, but what little I had wasn't enough." Douglas' heart ached. Without a second thought, he walked into the restaurant and went straight to the manager. "Here's the money for that lady's meal," he said, handing over what little he had earned that day. "No one deserves to be treated like that." The manager took the money with disdain, but didn't say a word. Douglas returned to the elderly woman and helped her to her feet. "There you go. Everything's sorted. What's your name?" The emotional elderly woman replied, "My name is Virginia." "Thank you so much, young man. I was so embarrassed. I don't know how to repay your kindness." Douglas smiled and said, "No need to repay me. I just wanted to help." Mrs. Virginia wiped her tears and looked at Raquel, who was now standing beside her father. "You're such a kind man, and you have a wonderful daughter." Before leaving, still a bit nervous, Mrs. Virginia said goodbye, but Douglas noticed her unease. "If you'd like, I can walk you home." "It's no trouble at all," he suggested. Mrs. Virginia, looking confused, gladly accepted the offer. As they walked, Douglas noticed that she couldn't remember her way home. Fortunately, He found a crumpled piece of paper in her purse with an address and a name, Claudio. The note explained that Mrs. Virginia suffered from Alzheimer's and sometimes got lost, forgetting her way back. Determined to help, Douglas held Raquel's hand and guided Mrs. Virginia to the address on the note, ensuring she got home safely. Mrs. Virginia, now calmer, began chatting with Douglas about her life. She explained that she lived with her grandson, Claudio, who worked almost all day but always found time to take care of her. "He's a good boy, but sometimes I get lost. My memory isn't what it used to be," she said with a sad smile. Douglas listened attentively, feeling respect and affection for the elderly woman and her grandson, who took such good care of her. Raquel, always curious, started asking Mrs. Virginia questions, which she answered with patience and sweetness. What could have been a tiring walk turned into a light-hearted conversation, making the time pass quickly. When they arrived at Mrs. Virginia's house, it was a small but well-kept home. She smiled as she recognized it and said, "This is it. Thank you so much, young man. You were an angel today." Douglas smiled back, saying it was nothing and that he was happy to help. Still, Mrs. Virginia insisted on writing down Douglas's phone number so her grandson could thank him later. Feeling a bit awkward, Douglas gave his number, imagining that Claudio would indeed want to express his gratitude. Upon returning home, Douglas and Raquel finally felt the exhaustion from their long day. Douglas's mother, who was still recovering from pneumonia, listened intently as he recounted the encounter with Mrs. Virginia. With a proud look, she said, "You did a good thing today, Douglas. Small acts of kindness can make a big difference in the world, and what we give in goodness always comes back to us." Douglas reflected on that as he tucked Raquel into bed. Life could be tough, but moments like these reminded him that there was still room for kindness and compassion in the world. He slept peacefully, knowing he had done something good, even amidst his own challenges. The next morning, Douglas received a surprise call. When he answered, he heard a polite, youthful voice on the other end. "Hi, is this Douglas? I'm Claudio, Virginia's grandson. I just wanted to thank you for helping my grandmother yesterday. She told me everything, and I really appreciate what you did." Douglas humbly replied, "There's no need to thank me. I just did what anyone would." But Claudio insisted, "Even so, I'd like to repay you for the restaurant bill." Douglas politely declined, saying it had been his pleasure to help. But Claudio didn't give up. "Then at least let me do something to thank you. How about lunch next weekend? You and your daughter could come to our house. My grandmother would love to see you both again, and so would I. You can bring anyone else you'd like." Surprised and touched by the invitation, Douglas began to consider it, realizing that small acts of kindness could indeed lead to unexpected bonds. Douglas hesitated. He wasn't used to accepting invitations, especially from people he didn't know well. But something about the way Claudio had spoken felt sincere and made Douglas think that maybe it was a good idea, particularly for his daughter, Raquel, who hardly ever had moments of fun. So, he decided, "All right, we'll accept the invitation. It'll be good for my daughter." On Saturday, Douglas, Raquel, and his mother dressed up in the best clothes they had. Raquel was excited, wearing her favorite dress. Douglas's mother tried to hide her nervousness. They hardly ever went to events like that, so the anticipation was high. When they arrived at Claudio's house, they were greeted by Donna Virginia, his grandmother. She was thrilled to see Douglas and Raquel again. "I'm so happy you all came," she said, hugging everyone warmly. Claudio, a man in his early 30s with a friendly smile, shook Douglas's hand. "Nice to meet you, Douglas. Thank you for coming. Come on in. Lunch is almost ready." Claudio's house was simple but cozy, filled with details that showed how much he cared for his grandmother. On the table, a modest but delicious lunch awaited them. The smell of homemade food filled the air, making everyone hungry. During lunch, the conversation flowed easily. Claudio talked about his work as a doctor, which, despite being tiring, he did with dedication to take care of his grandmother. Douglas spoke about life as a street vendor, the struggles, and the little joys he found in everyday life. Raquel, always curious, asked Claudio many questions about his job and also shared how she helped her father with his sales. Douglas's mother, who had been quiet at first, began to feel more comfortable and even shared some funny stories from her life. Donna Virginia also joined in, recalling stories from her youth in one of the rare moments when her memory was clear despite her Alzheimer's. At the end of the lunch, Claudio stood up and made a toast. "Thank you all for coming. This lunch is a small way to show our gratitude. I hope we can gather like this more often." Douglas, moved, also raised his glass. "Thank you for the invitation. It was a pleasure to be here today. Life is hard sometimes, but moments like this show that there's always room for new friendships." As they were leaving, Claudio handed Douglas a small envelope. "Please take this. It's just a little help for tough times. You've been very kind to my grandmother, and I want to give something back." Douglas opened the envelope and saw a sum of money. He hesitated but realized that Claudio truly wanted to help. "Thank you very much. This will make a big difference." On the way back home, Douglas felt grateful. The kindness of a stranger had turned into a new friendship and, more than that, hope for better days. But shortly after they arrived, Raquel began to feel unwell. She was pale and complained of stomach pain. Worried, Douglas remembered that Claudio was a doctor. Without thinking twice, he picked up the phone and called him quickly. "Claudio, it's Douglas. We need help." Douglas was nervous as he called Claudio. "Raquel isn't well. Her belly is swollen, and I don't know what to do." Douglas's voice shook with anxiety. Claudio, sensing the urgency, responded quickly. "I'm on my way. I'll be there in a few minutes." In no time, Claudio arrived. He carefully examined Raquel, noticing how much pain she was in and the swelling in her belly. After a few minutes, he stood up, serious, and said, "Douglas, we need to take Raquel to the hospital now. I think she has appendicitis and will need emergency surgery." Douglas was scared but trusted Claudio. "All right, let's go. Please save my daughter." Claudio and Douglas put Raquel in the car and rushed to the hospital. Along the way, Claudio tried to stay calm, talking to Raquel and reassuring Douglas. When they arrived at the hospital, Claudio quickly organized everything, and soon the tests confirmed Raquel's appendix was inflamed. She needed urgent surgery. Claudio, being an experienced doctor, prepared for the operation. Douglas, with a heavy heart, held his daughter's hand until the door of the operating room. He whispered words of love, trying to comfort her. The wait was long and agonizing for Douglas, but finally, after a few hours, Claudio came out of the operating room with a tired smile. The surgery was a success. Raquel is fine. She just needs a few days to recover. Douglas felt a huge wave of relief and gratitude. "Thank you, Claudio. You saved my daughter's life. I can never thank you enough." Claudio, placing a hand on Douglas's shoulder, replied, "I was just doing my job. The most important thing is that Raquel is okay." That night, while Raquel recovered, Douglas stayed by her side at the hospital. He was deeply grateful and tried to return the money he had given to Claudio. But Claudio firmly refused. "Douglas, that money was given from the heart to help you during tough times. I can't accept it back. I know what it's like to go through hard times and rely on others' help. You helped my grandmother in the past. Now it's my turn to give back." Douglas, moved, finally accepted. "Thank you, Claudio. I promise I'll find a way to repay you one day." Claudio smiled and responded, "The greatest repayment is seeing Raquel healthy and happy. That's enough for me. Now I need to go home. My shift is over." They said goodbye, and Douglas went back to caring for Raquel, who still had a long night ahead. But in the middle of the night, Claudio came rushing into the room. "Douglas, I need to tell you something urgent. While we were operating on Raquel, Grandma Virginia disappeared from home and was hit by a car." Douglas was walking down the street when he heard something he couldn't believe. Claudio, with a sorrowful voice, shared that Grandma Virginia, the grandmother he cared so much about, was in the hospital in critical condition. Douglas, already exhausted from work and daily worries, felt like he was living a nightmare. He quickly asked if he could help with anything, but Grandma Virginia's condition was very delicate. A few hours later, despite the doctor's best efforts, Grandma Virginia didn't survive and passed away. Claudio was completely devastated, as losing his grandmother, whom he cared for so deeply, was a very harsh blow. Douglas, feeling his friend's sorrow, feared that Claudio might blame him for the tragedy. After all, it was Douglas who took Claudio away from home the day Grandma Virginia was hit. On the day of the funeral, Claudio was silent, clearly shaken by the loss. Douglas tried to approach him and said, "My condolences, Claudio. Life is so fragile. I'm sure your grandmother is in a better place now." But Claudio, still hurt, responded harshly, "Yeah, maybe if I had been home, she wouldn't have gone out and she'd still be alive." Douglas was shocked by his friend's words, but, respecting Claudio's grief, decided to keep his distance. Even so, he couldn't stop worrying. With each passing day, it seemed that their friendship was drifting further apart. One day, while Raquel, Douglas's daughter, played in the yard, he sat in the kitchen with his mother. "Mom, I'm really worried about Claudio. He's so sad, and I don't know how to help," he confided. Douglas's mother, always wise, replied kindly, "Son, Claudio is going through a very difficult time. Losing someone we love is never easy, and everyone needs their own time to heal. Give him space, but show that you're there for him. Sometimes just knowing we have friends by our side makes all the difference." Douglas thought about his mother's words and decided he needed to do something to show his support, even if Claudio wasn't ready to accept it. That night, he grabbed some paper and a pen and began writing. "Claudio, I know this is a very difficult time, and no words can take away your pain. I want you to know that I'm here for you, as I always have been. Your grandmother was an amazing person, and I'm sure she knew how much you loved and cared for her." Douglas really wanted to help his friend Claudio, who was going through such a tough time. So, he wrote a simple letter saying, "I know you're hurting, but I want you to know that you're not alone. If you need anything, whether it's a conversation, a shoulder to lean on, or just someone to be around, I'm here. Sincerely, Douglas." He folded the letter and, on Monday, went to Claudio's house. Since no one was there, he left the letter and some food his mother had prepared at the door, hoping Claudio would find them. Days passed, and Douglas continued selling his products on the street, always with Raquel, who was doing much better now. He tried not to think too much about Claudio, but the concern never left him. After a few days, without any word, Claudio called. He sounded calmer and said, "Douglas, I want to apologize for the way I acted. I know you weren't responsible for what happened to my grandmother. She always talked about the kindness of people, and I'm sure she'd want me to move on with my life." Douglas felt relieved and replied, "Claudio, you don't need to apologize. Losing someone is really hard, and everyone deals with it in their own way. I'm here for whatever you need." Claudio, in a hurry, said he had to go to a meeting. "Thanks, Douglas, but I'm running late. We'll talk later." A few days later, in the morning, while Douglas and Raquel were setting up their sales stand, Claudio appeared. He looked thinner and tired, but there was something different in his eyes, a desire to move forward. "Douglas," he said in a weak voice, "thank you for the letter and the meals. I'm sorry I didn't reach out sooner. I needed some time." Douglas smiled, feeling a weight lifted. "You don't need to apologize, Claudio. I just wanted you to know I'm here." Claudio glanced at Raquel, who also smiled and said, "I'm trying to move on. It still hurts, but knowing I have friends like you makes it a bit easier." Then he invited Douglas and his family to lunch next Sunday. "I'd like you, Raquel, and your mother to come for lunch. I think my grandmother would be happy knowing our friendship continues." Douglas accepted the invitation with a smile, happy to know that his friendship with Claudio was intact. On Sunday, he, Raquel, and his mother prepared for lunch. Even with the absence of Donna Virginia, the atmosphere felt lighter. When they arrived, they were greeted with a big smile from Claudio. "It's good to see you all here," he said, and the house, though quiet, seemed a little more cheerful. Claudio and Douglas sat down at the table for a simple but special lunch. Even without Donna Virginia, they felt her presence. Claudio had placed flowers on the table, something she always did, which brought back memories of the joy she spread. During lunch, Claudio spoke more about his grandmother, sharing how difficult it was to cope with the loss, but also how important it was to move forward. "She always taught me to see the good in things, even when everything seemed tough. Knowing you all has helped me remember that," he said. Douglas, smiling, shared that Raquel was recovering well, and talked about his new adventures as a street vendor. His mother also told funny stories from when he was little, making everyone laugh. Raquel, always curious, asked Claudio about the story of Dona Virginia and how she was before losing her memory. Claudio smiled and said, "Raquel, you remind me a lot of my grandmother. Always curious and full of energy. She would have loved meeting you." Douglas interrupted the conversation, looking at Claudio and saying, "Your friendship means a lot to me. I'm here for whatever you need. Always." Claudio nodded, and the two shook hands, sealing a new phase in their friendship. Over time, they faced life's ups and downs together, always supporting each other and remembering that kindness and support between friends are powerful forces. Many years passed, and another tragedy struck Douglas. Almost 15 years after the death of Dona Virginia, he was sitting by the hospital bed of Raquel, now 20 years old, in a coma after a terrible car accident. Douglas's life had changed a lot since his days as a street vendor. With Claudio's help, he managed to improve his situation and opened a small market that thrived. Claudio, on the other hand, had become the head of the hospital. However, seeing Raquel in a coma stirred up feelings of anger and vengeance. Douglas blamed her boyfriend, Flavio, for the accident, since it was his idea to travel at night. Flavio only suffered minor injuries, but Raquel was in critical condition. Unable to cope with the pain, Douglas banned Flavio from visiting her and used his influence to make life difficult for him, even getting him fired from his job. And so, the emotions of anger and sadness took over Douglas's heart as he tried to deal with yet another tragedy in his life. Douglas was feeling so overwhelmed by everything that had happened, he decided to move into a very simple cabin, far from the city. He no longer had enough money to pay rent, so he relied on help from friends and family to get food. Every day, he found himself sinking deeper into sadness and guilt, and the worst part was not being able to see Raquel, the love of his life, lying in the hospital. Claudio, who was both a doctor and a family friend, visited Raquel regularly. He not only took care of her, but also worried about Douglas, who seemed more consumed by anger every day. One quiet afternoon, while watching over Raquel, Claudio decided it was time to talk to Douglas. "Douglas, we need to talk," Claudio said, pulling up a chair beside his friend. "I know you're suffering, but this anger toward Flavio won't bring Raquel back." Douglas looked at Claudio, his eyes full of pain. "But he's the one to blame, Claudio. He put Raquel in danger." "I understand your anger," Claudio responded calmly, "but blame and vengeance won't help Raquel recover. In fact, they're destroying you. I'm sure Flavio is suffering too and feels deeply guilty." Douglas sighed, feeling the weight of Claudio's words. "But what can I do?" he asked, his voice full of despair. "He shouldn't be allowed to move on while Raquel is lying there like that." "We all make mistakes, Douglas," Claudio said with compassion. "And we all deserve a chance to redeem ourselves. Think about Raquel. What do you think she would want you to do?" Douglas listened to his friend, but even so, his heart remained full of anger. In the months that followed, Raquel stayed in a coma, and Douglas did everything he could to ensure no one even mentioned Flavio's name. A year later, Flavio had no news of Raquel. The pain of being kept away from her and the uncertainty of her condition consumed him every day. Claudio, seeing the suffering on both sides and realizing something needed to change, decided to take action. He believed fate could use a little nudge to resolve the situation. So, Claudio called Flavio and invited him for a talk. "Flavio, I need to speak with you," Claudio said over the phone as he drove to Flavio's house. "I know the situation between you and Douglas is difficult. The pain has changed my friend in ways even he doesn't recognize anymore." Flavio listened in silence, understanding that the situation was bigger than his own pain. "I know, Claudio," Flavio replied with sadness in his voice. "My biggest wish is to be by Raquel's side, but I can't even imagine reaching out to Douglas." "Take it easy," Claudio said, ready to help them both find a solution. "Hey, I'm coming to get you. When we get to my place, there's someone who wants to talk to you," Claudio said. Flavio agreed, waiting for Claudio to pick him up. When they arrived at Claudio's house, They were greeted by Douglas, who was already waiting at the door with a serious expression, as if carrying a heavy burden in his heart. Before Flavio could say anything, Douglas interrupted him and said, "Flavio, I'm so sorry. I shouldn't have blamed you the way I did. I was so angry that I couldn't see what really mattered." Flavio, suspicious, stayed silent for a moment, processing what Douglas had said. Then, Douglas took a deep breath and revealed something important. "Flavio, there's something you need to know." With a mix of anxiety and hope, Douglas led Flavio to the living room. There, on the couch, was Raquel, with a shy smile on her face. Although she seemed a little weak, she was clearly doing better. Flavio, unable to believe what he was seeing, rushed to her and hugged her tightly. "Raquel, my love, are you okay?" he asked, emotional. Raquel nodded, and her eyes filled with tears. "I woke up a month ago. I was so scared of dying. You have no idea how much I missed you." Meanwhile, Douglas, relieved, watched the scene. He knew he had a lot to explain to Raquel. The fact that she was there, awake and well, was a miracle he would never dare question. However, he was also worried about how he had handled the situation during Raquel's coma, fearing it could push her away from him. The joyful moment was interrupted when Raquel, with a serious expression, asked, "Flavio, did you come to see me at the hospital?" Before Flavio could respond, Douglas, afraid of Raquel's reaction, quickly lied, saying that Flavio had visited her all the time. Flavio stayed quiet, knowing it wasn't true, but he chose not to say anything. Claudio, who had been watching everything closely and sensed the tension in the air, decided to intervene. "Douglas, I think we need to talk privately." Douglas, aware of the complicated situation, agreed. He knew things couldn't go on like this. Claudio and Douglas went to a quiet corner, away from everything. Claudio looked at Douglas seriously and said, "We need to talk about something very important. Raquel and Flavio deserve to know the truth." Douglas, feeling he had to face his past, agreed. "You're right, Claudio. I didn't want to hurt Raquel. I just didn't let Flavio visit her because I thought he was responsible for the accident that put her in a coma. I acted without thinking." Claudio placed a hand on Douglas's shoulder and said, "I understand. You did what you thought was right at the time, but now we need to fix this together." The two returned to the living room, where Raquel was looking out the window, deep in thought. Flavio was sitting beside her. When the door opened, Raquel turned around, noticing the seriousness on Claudio and Douglas's faces. "Dad, what's going on? Why didn't you tell me the truth about the time I was in a coma?" Raquel asked, worried. Claudio, trying to ease the tension, said, "Calm down, Raquel. Douglas has something important to tell you." Douglas took a deep breath and, with courage, said, "Honey, I lied about Flavio. He didn't move away, and he didn't find someone else. I stopped him from visiting you because I thought he was to blame for the accident, and that was a mistake." Raquel was speechless, trying to understand what her father had just said. She looked at Claudio, who simply nodded, encouraging her to listen to Flavio. He, who had remained quiet, finally spoke. "Raquel, I'm so sorry. I never wanted to cause that accident. The guilt I've carried for not being able to visit you is because I love you, and I'm here to support you in whatever you need." When Raquel looked into Flavio's eyes, she felt his sincerity. Tears began to stream down her face as she ran to him and embraced him tightly. "I love you so much," she whispered, overwhelmed with emotion. Douglas watched the scene, feeling a mix of relief and regret. He knew that the road to fixing things would be long, but he was determined to make it right. Life, even full of problems and lies, still offered chances for forgiveness and new beginnings. And Douglas was ready to walk alongside his daughter and the people who loved her. However, Raquel decided to go her own way. She rekindled her relationship with Flavio and moved in with him, which led to Raquel cutting off contact with her father. Douglas was sad, but deep down, he knew he was doing what he thought was right. Douglas was going through a very difficult time. He couldn't stop thinking about his daughter, Raquel. The pain of not seeing her every day made him sad, and each day was a reminder of how his choices had separated them. He tried to stay strong, but his friend Claudio noticed that Douglas was drowning in his own sorrow. It was Raquel's birthday, and Douglas was home, sitting alone. He picked up some photo albums that held happy memories. As he flipped through the pages, tears rolled down his face. He remembered Raquel's radiant smile on her first day of school, the tight hugs they shared on rainy days, and the laughter from fun afternoons at the park. Every image felt like a stab to his heart. Suddenly, there was a knock at the door. The sound startled him, and his heart began to race. He stood up and opened the door. And there they were, Raquel and Flavio. Raquel had a shy smile, but it was warm, and Flavio was holding her hand tenderly. When Douglas saw Raquel was pregnant, he felt a rush of emotions. "Hi, Dad," Raquel said softly. Her eyes showed a love and forgiveness that didn't need words. Douglas stood still, looking at his daughter and the man she loved. The tears came again, but this time, they were tears of relief and happiness. He hugged Raquel with all the love he had and gave Flavio a warm hug too. I don't know what to say," Douglas murmured, emotional. "I've missed you so much." Raquel smiled and gently touched her father's face. "We missed you too, Dad," she replied. Flavio, sensing the special moment, decided to speak. "Douglas, we came because Raquel and I want you to be part of our lives. We want you to meet your granddaughter, who's on the way." The news took Douglas by surprise, but it also brought a wave of emotion and gratitude. He looked at Raquel and saw in her the strength that had made him proud ever since she was born. It reminded him that, despite the mistakes of the past, there was always room for love and new beginnings. Sitting together in the living room, Douglas, Raquel, and Flavio started sharing stories, laughter, and even a few tears. Raquel explained that, during the months they were apart, she found space in her heart to forgive her father. "I didn't want to cut you out of my life, Dad," Raquel admitted. "I just needed some time to process everything. Now, I want you to be part of your daughter's and granddaughter's lives." Douglas felt a lump in his throat as he heard those words. He knew he had a lot to learn and make up for, but he also realized this was the beginning of a new chapter for all of them. Looking at Flavio, he was grateful for his patience and understanding. "I promise to be a better grandfather than I was a father at times," Douglas said sincerely. "And I'll be here for you both as best as I can." Flavio smiled warmly and replied, "We believe in you, Douglas, and we're in this together." The night continued with conversations and smiles, and the hope of a new beginning filled the air. Douglas was filled with hugs, words of forgiveness, and a lot of hope for the future. He knew he still had a lot of work ahead to fix his relationship with Raquel and redeem himself for the choices he made in the past. With a new life on the way, Douglas felt a renewed strength and was determined to do everything right. He wanted to love his family with all his heart and learn from his mistakes. As time passed, Douglas truly dedicated himself to rebuilding his relationship with Raquel. He realized that change wasn't just about saying the right things, but about acting differently. Douglas wanted to show Raquel that he was genuinely committed to being a better person. He worked hard to be more understanding, patient, and less controlling. One special way he found to redeem himself was by getting involved in preparations for the baby's arrival. Douglas helped Raquel and Flavio set up the baby's room, bought gifts, and always offered kind advice. This involvement not only brought the family closer together, but also brought joy to Douglas, who was very excited to become a grandfather. Raquel, in turn, began visiting her father's house more often. Over time, the emotional wounds started to heal. They began laughing together, having more open conversations, and reminiscing about the good times they had in the past. Raquel's father, Claudio, played a key role in this process. He was always there to help and encourage reconciliation. His calm and understanding presence made everyone feel safe to express their emotions and resolve conflicts peacefully. As a doctor, Claudio accompanied Raquel throughout her pregnancy. As the months passed, Douglas's home filled with anticipation and preparations for the baby's arrival. Everyone was eager for the day when the new life would arrive, bringing not only joy but also the certainty that, despite the challenges of the past, a bright future awaited them. The months flew by, filled with doctor's appointments and an atmosphere of love. Douglas found peace within himself, knowing he was doing his best to be a better father and grandfather. He reflected on his experiences, learning from his past mistakes, and committing to growing as a person and family member. Finally, the big day arrived. Douglas was by Raquel and Flavio's side at the hospital, ready to celebrate the arrival of the new family member. Happiness was in the air. It was a very special day. Douglas was preparing for the birth of his granddaughter. When he held the baby for the first time, he felt such an overwhelming emotion that it seemed his heart would burst with happiness. He promised to be a present and loving grandfather to this little one who had just arrived, filling everyone's life with joy. Claudio, a great friend of Douglas, watched everything with tears in his eyes. He was a traveling salesman and had helped the baby's grandmother. Now, seeing his friend's granddaughter being born, he couldn't hold back his emotions. What he felt was a mix of gratitude and happiness. When Raquel, the mother, held her daughter for the first time, she decided to pay tribute. "My daughter's name will be Donna Virginia," she announced in honor of her grandmother. Douglas was so moved that tears streamed down his face. He remembered all the challenges they had faced together as a family. Kindness and love had always been their strengths. The night passed peacefully, and Douglas knew that, even if the future brought challenges, they were ready to face them together. True happiness was in their unity, full of love and respect. He closed his eyes for a moment, silently giving thanks for all the blessings in life. Douglas, Claudio, Raquel, and Flavio had not only overcome their problems, but had grown together. Claudio continued working at the hospital, always dedicating his time to helping others. Raquel and Flavio built a beautiful family and raised little Virginia with lots of love. And Douglas, now a doting grandfather, found peace in seeing his family happy and united. So, did you enjoy the story? The Universo Yin Palabras channel thanks you for your company. Don't forget to give the video a like, subscribe to the channel, and leave a comment sharing your thoughts about the story. See you next time.